I'm telling you this story because I need someone to understand why I can't sleep alone anymore, why I check my locks 3 times before bed, and why the sound of gravel crunching under tires makes my heart race. It's been 2 years since that night, and I still wake up in cold sweats, hearing the sound of my rear window exploding into 1,000 pieces. I used to love solo camping. There was something magical about hitching up my little travel trailer and heading out to remote spots where the only sounds were wind through the trees and the distant call of night birds. My caravan wasn't anything fancy, just a modest 20-foot trailer with everything I needed for a peaceful weekend away from the chaos of city life. It had become my sanctuary, my escape from the stress of my demanding job and the constant noise of urban living. That particular weekend in October, I'd chosen a spot I'd never been to before. It was a dispersed camping area about 3 hours north of the city, tucked away in a national forest where cell service was spotty at best. The ranger at the information center had marked it on my map with a smile, telling me it was one of the more secluded areas, perfect for someone looking to truly get away from it all. The drive up was beautiful. Fall colors painted the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds, and the winding forest roads felt like passages to another world. I passed maybe 4 other vehicles in the last hour of driving, and by the time I reached the camping area, I felt that familiar sense of peace settling over me like a comfortable blanket. The spot I chose was perfect. A level clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small creek babbling nearby, and a fire ring already established by previous campers. I spent the afternoon setting up camp, arranging my outdoor furniture, and gathering firewood. The isolation felt complete and wonderful. The nearest other campsite was easily half a mile away, and I could see no signs of other campers anywhere in the area. As evening approached, I built a small fire and settled into my camping chair with a book and a cup of tea. The forest was alive with the gentle sounds of nature. Owls calling to each other across the darkness, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the steady whisper of wind through the pine needles. It was exactly what I'd been craving after months of overtime and city stress. I stayed up later than usual, enjoying the peace and the dancing flames of my campfire. It wasn't until nearly midnight that I finally decided to call it a night. I doused the fire carefully, secured my outdoor gear, and retreated into my trailer. The routine was familiar and comforting. Locking the door, pulling the curtains closed, checking that all the windows were latched properly. My trailer had windows on all sides, which I normally loved because it made the small space feel open and connected to the outdoors. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I found myself feeling oddly exposed. It was probably just because this was a new location, I told myself. Sometimes it took a night or two to feel completely comfortable in an unfamiliar place. I was just settling into bed, listening to the creek and the night sounds when I heard it. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. At first, I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or elk wandering through the campsite. But the rhythm was wrong. Too measured, too deliberate. These were human footsteps, and they were circling my trailer. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps made a slow circuit around my caravan. They paused at each window, and I could swear I heard breathing as if someone was pressed close to the glass, listening for signs of life inside. My heart was hammering so loudly I was certain whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps completed one full circle, then another. Each time they passed my bedroom window, they seemed to linger a little longer. I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was in the middle of nowhere, exactly where I'd wanted to be just hours earlier. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I waited, straining my ears for any sound, but the forest had gone completely silent. Even the creek seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I began to think maybe whoever it was had left, had moved on to somewhere else. That's when I heard the soft scraping sound at my door. Someone was trying the handle. The lock held, but I could hear them testing it, gently at first, then with more pressure. The door rattled slightly in its frame, and I realized with growing horror that trailer doors weren't meant to keep out determined intruders. They were designed for privacy and weather protection, not security. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet silent on the small floor. My mind was racing, trying to think of what I could use as a weapon. I had a small kitchen knife, some camping tools, but nothing that would be much good against someone determined to get inside. The scraping at the door stopped, and for a moment I dared to hope that whoever it was had given up. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold, the soft squeak of one of my stabilizer jacks being lowered. They were trying to destabilize my trailer. That's when I knew I had to get out of there. I couldn't just wait and hope they'd leave. I had to act. Moving as quietly as I could, I grabbed my keys and my shoes. My truck was parked about 20 feet away from the trailer's door, and if I could get to it fast enough, I might be able to drive away before whoever was out there could stop me. I crept to the door and listened. I couldn't hear anything, but that almost made it worse. Where were they? What were they doing? Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door as quietly as possible. The click of the lock seemed to echo through the night like a gunshot. I waited, listening, but heard nothing. Maybe they'd moved away from the door. Maybe this was my chance. I eased the door open just a crack and peered out into the darkness. My truck sat in the moonlight, looking impossibly far away. I couldn't see anyone, but the shadows between the trees could have hidden an army. There was no choice. I had to run for it. I threw the door open and sprinted toward my truck, keys clutched in my hand. The 20 feet felt like 20 miles, and with every step I expected to feel hands grabbing at me from the darkness. I reached the truck and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the right one into the lock. Behind me, I heard a shout, a man's voice, rough and angry. Footsteps pounded across the campsite, closing in fast. I managed to get at the door unlocked and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me and hitting the lock button. A figure emerged from the shadows near my trailer, a tall man in dark clothing moving toward my truck with purposeful strides. In the moonlight, I could see he was wearing some kind of mask or had something covering his face. He was carrying something in his hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. I got the engine started on the second try and threw the truck into reverse. The man broke into a run, and I saw him raise whatever he was carrying above his head. I gunned the engine, gravel spraying from under my tires as I backed away from the campsite as fast as I dared. That's when he threw it. The rear window of my truck cab exploded in a shower of glass, the safety glass creating a spider web of cracks before collapsing entirely. I screamed and hunched forward, pressing on the accelerator as glass rained down on me. Whatever he'd thrown, a rock, a piece of firewood, I never found out, had come through the window with enough force to embed itself in my front dashboard. I kept backing up until I could turn around, then floored it down the dark forest road. In my rearview mirror, I could see a flashlight beam waving back and forth in the distance, but I didn't slow down until I reached the main highway 20 minutes later. I drove straight to the nearest town, which was still 40 minutes away, and went directly to the police station. The desk sergeant listened to my story with a mixture of concern and skepticism. I could tell he was wondering if I'd just panicked over a curious animal or an innocent camper who'd lost their way in the dark. But the shattered rear window was hard to dismiss, and when I described how deliberately the footsteps had circled my trailer, how someone had tested my door handle and tried to destabilize the camper, his expression grew more serious. "You said he was wearing a mask?" the officer asked, taking notes. Something over his face. I couldn't see his features clearly in the moonlight, but it looked like he was deliberately trying to conceal his identity. "And you're sure he was trying to get into your trailer?" "He was testing the door handle, trying to see if it was locked, and he was definitely tampering with the stabilizer jacks. Those don't move on their own." The officer nodded and called for a deputy to take a formal report. They asked if I wanted to go back to the campsite with them, but the thought of returning to that isolated clearing in the dark made me physically ill. Instead, I checked into a motel and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, jumping at every sound in the hallway. The next morning, 2 deputies drove out to the campsite to investigate. They found my trailer exactly where I'd left it, apparently undisturbed. But they also found evidence that someone had been there. Footprints in the soft earth around the campsite, cigarette butts that weren't mine, and, most disturbing of all, what looked like a makeshift camp hidden about 100 yards away in the dense trees. Someone had been watching your site for a while, one of the deputies told me when I met them back at the station. There were candy bar wrappers and drink cans scattered around, all relatively fresh. Looks like they'd been there for at least a day, maybe longer. The thought that someone had been observing me, planning whatever they'd intended to do, made me sick to my stomach. I'd been going about my normal camping routine, setting up, building a fire, reading by the flames, completely unaware that predatory eyes were watching my every move. Any idea who it might have been? I asked. We're checking with other agencies, seeing if there have been similar incidents in the area. Sometimes we get drifters who target solo campers, especially women. They usually move on pretty quickly if they think law enforcement is looking for them. The deputies took photos of my shattered rear window and collected the projectile that had been embedded in my dashboard, a jagged piece of granite about the size of a softball. The force required to throw it through a rear window from that distance suggested someone with considerable strength and possibly experience with this kind of intimidation. You did the right thing getting out of there when you did, the senior deputy told me. Whatever this person's intentions were, they weren't good. I never found out who he was or what he'd wanted. The police investigated for several weeks, checking with rangers and local law enforcement throughout the region. They found 2 other reports of similar incidents over the past year, both involving solo female campers who'd reported feeling watched and followed, though in those cases the women had packed up and left during daylight hours before anything escalated. In one case, a woman reported finding her campsite had been searched while she was away hiking, with items moved and rearranged in a way that made it clear someone had been going through her belongings. In another, a camper woke to find food missing from her camp kitchen and fresh footprints around her tent that definitely weren't hers. The pattern suggested someone who specifically targeted women camping alone, someone who knew the remote areas well enough to observe potential victims without being detected. The thought that there was a predator out there, moving through the wilderness and hunting for vulnerable people, haunted me for months. I retrieved my trailer a few days later, accompanied by 2 friends and a deputy sheriff. The campsite looked peaceful and innocent in the daylight, giving no hint of the terror I'd experienced there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the tree line as we hitched up the trailer and prepared to leave. On the drive out, my friend riding with me pointed to a high ridge overlooking the camping area. "Good vantage point up there," she said casually. "You could watch the whole valley from that spot." I looked up at the ridge and felt a chill run down my spine. Someone could have been up there with binoculars, studying the comings and goings of campers, choosing their targets, planning their approach. The isolation I'd once found so appealing now seemed like a trap, a way for predators to corner their prey, far from help or witnesses. That was the last time I went camping alone. I still love the outdoors, still crave the peace and beauty of remote places, but now I only camp with groups, friends, organized camping clubs, or in established campgrounds where there are other people around. The spontaneous solo adventures that used to feed my soul have become too frightening to contemplate. I've replaced the rear window of my truck, but I kept the piece of granite that shattered it. It sits on my desk at home, a reminder of how quickly a peaceful evening can turn into a nightmare, how thin the line is between solitude and vulnerability. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't heard those footsteps, if I'd been a deeper sleeper, or had been wearing earplugs to block out forest sounds. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear gravel crunching under footsteps, and I have to get up and check all my locks before I can go back to sleep. My friends think I'm being paranoid, that I'm letting one bad experience ruin something I used to love. Maybe they're right. Maybe that person was just a disturbed individual passing through. Maybe I'll never encounter anything like that again. The memory of those deliberate footsteps circling my trailer, the sound of someone testing my door handle, the crash of glass as that rock came through my rear window. Those memories have changed me in ways I can't undo. I know there are good people in the world, fellow outdoor enthusiasts who would never dream of hurting another person. But I also know now that there are predators out there. People who see solo campers not as fellow nature lovers, but as opportunities. They know the remote places, they understand how to move unseen through the wilderness, and they're counting on the isolation that draws so many of us to these beautiful, dangerous places. The wilderness hasn't changed. It's still as beautiful and peaceful as ever. But my relationship with it has been forever altered by the knowledge that sometimes, in the most remote and lovely places, the greatest danger isn't from wild animals or natural disasters. Sometimes the most dangerous predator in the wilderness walks on two legs and knows exactly how to use our love of solitude against us. I still have my trailer. It sits in my driveway, ready for adventure, waiting for the next group camping trip. But those days of heading out alone into the unknown are over. That night in the forest taught me that some prices are too high to pay for solitude, and some risks aren't worth taking, no matter how beautiful the destination might be. The person who terrorized me that night is still out there somewhere. Maybe they've moved on to other hunting grounds, maybe they've been caught for some other crime, or maybe they're still stalking through remote campsites, looking for their next victim. I'll probably never know, but I know I survived, and I know I'll never put myself in that position again. I've been telling people for 18 years that the wilderness doesn't scare me. Bears, mountain lions, sudden weather changes, equipment failures, I've dealt with all of it and come out fine. When you've spent as many nights alone under the stars as I have, you develop an immunity to the kinds of fears that keep most people in their suburban comfort zones. You learn to read the forest, to understand what belongs and what doesn't, to trust your instincts when something feels off. That confidence served me well until I encountered something at Emerald Lake that my years of experience couldn't explain or categorize. Even now, 3 years later, I still find myself thinking about what I saw there, trying to make sense of an encounter that defied every rational explanation I could construct. Emerald Lake sits at the end of a punishing 6-mile trail that climbs nearly 3,000 feet through some of the most rugged country in the region. It's the kind of destination that separates serious hikers from weekend warriors, remote enough that you're unlikely to encounter crowds, challenging enough that most people don't attempt it with a full backpacking load. I'd been wanting to fish there for years, ever since a Forest Service ranger mentioned it contained some of the last wild brook trout in the area. The hike-in was brutal, even by my standards. I left my caravan at the trailhead parking area and loaded my backpack with everything I'd need for 3 days of wilderness camping. Tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, food, fishing gear, water purification system. The weight was manageable for someone with my experience, but the trail was relentless, switchbacking up steep granite faces and traversing loose scree fields that required careful footing. By the time I reached the lake basin, I was exhausted but exhilarated. The location was everything I'd hoped for, a pristine alpine lake nestled between towering peaks, its surface so still it perfectly mirrored the surrounding cliffs. The water had that distinctive emerald tint that gives the lake its name, created by glacial flowers suspended in the depths. I could see trout rising to feed on insects near the far shore, dimpling the surface with concentric circles that spread outward like ripples of possibility. I set up camp on a small flat area about 50 yards from the water's edge, positioning my tent to take advantage of the morning sun while staying protected from the prevailing winds that funneled through the valley. The routine was familiar and comforting, staking out guy lines, inflating my sleeping pad, organizing gear in the vestibule. After the long hike, there was something deeply satisfying about creating a temporary home in this remote wilderness. It was while I was assembling my fishing rod that I first noticed him. Movement on the opposite shore caught my eye, a figure walking along the water's edge about 400 yards away. At that distance, details were hard to make out, but the shape was unmistakably human. My first reaction was mild surprise. Emerald Lake wasn't exactly secret, but the difficulty of reaching it meant encounters with other hikers were rare. In all my years of backcountry travel, I'd learned to appreciate the unspoken etiquette among wilderness travelers. A wave of acknowledgement, maybe a brief conversation if you cross paths, mutual respect for each other's desire for solitude. I raised my hand in a friendly greeting, the universal gesture of one outdoorsman acknowledging another. The figure stopped walking and turned toward my camp. Even across the water, I could tell he was looking directly at me. I waited for the return wave that would complete our polite wilderness exchange. It never came. The man simply stood there, motionless, facing my position across the lake. After what felt like a full minute of this strange standoff, he walked to a large boulder near the shoreline and sat down. His posture was oddly rigid, unnatural, like someone consciously positioning themselves for optimal observation. I went back to rigging my fishing gear, occasionally glancing across the water to see what the stranger was doing. He remained in the same position, apparently focused on my campsite. When I waded into the shallows to make my first cast, I could feel his attention like a weight on my shoulders. When I moved to a different fishing spot 20 yards down the shore, his head turned to track my movement. As the morning progressed, the man's behavior became increasingly disturbing. He never seemed to rest, eat, or engage in any of the normal activities you'd expect from someone in the wilderness. He would occasionally stand and walk short distances along the shore, but his attention always returned to my camp with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I pulled out my binoculars for a closer look, and what I saw made the situation even more unsettling. The man was dressed in ordinary street clothes, a plain dark shirt, blue jeans, and work boots. No backpack, no hiking gear, no camping equipment that I could see. Nothing that would explain how he'd reached this remote location or what he planned to do for shelter, food, or water. More disturbing was his apparent indifference to the mountain environment. The elevation at Emerald Lake is over 10,000 feet, and even in summer, the temperatures rarely climb above 60 degrees during the day, dropping well below freezing at night. Yet this man sat exposed on a boulder, showing no signs of discomfort or concern about hypothermia. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe he was a day hiker who'd gotten an extremely early start and would be heading back before evening. Maybe he had gear cached somewhere I couldn't see. Maybe he was meeting other people who were arriving later. But as the afternoon wore on and he maintained his vigil, these explanations became increasingly inadequate. The man never seemed to drink water, despite the exertion required to reach this elevation. He never ate food or rested in shade during the hottest part of the day. Most unnervingly, he never looked away from my camp for more than a few seconds at a time. When I cooked lunch over my camp stove, he watched. When I sorted through my fishing gear, he watched. When I dozed in the afternoon sun, I could feel his eyes on me even through closed eyelids. As evening approached, I found myself dreading nightfall. The sustained observation was wearing on me in ways I hadn't expected. I'd camped alone in grisly country without feeling this level of unease, had weathered severe storms in remote locations without questioning my safety. But there was something about being watched by another human being with such persistent intensity that triggered every primitive alarm in my nervous system. When darkness finally settled over the basin, I lost sight of the man across the water. I told myself he'd probably headed back down the trail, that I'd wake up tomorrow to find myself alone at the lake as I had originally planned. But deep down, I knew he hadn't left. The feeling of being observed was too strong, like too persistent to simply vanish with the daylight. I built my campfire slightly larger than usual, more for psychological comfort than practical need. The flames created a circle of warmth and light around my tent, but they also made everything beyond that perimeter seem darker and more threatening. I cooked dinner and tried to follow my normal evening routine, but I found myself constantly scanning the tree line for movement, listening intently to every sound from the surrounding forest. That's when I started hearing the footsteps. They began as soft sounds in the underbrush behind my camp, not the random rustling of animals moving through the forest, but the deliberate, measured rhythm of someone walking carefully through unfamiliar terrain. The sounds seemed to circle my campsite, staying just outside the range of firelight, always moving when I tried to pinpoint their location. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the forest, calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Do you need help? The footsteps stopped immediately, but there was no response. The silence that followed was somehow more unsettling than the sounds had been, the kind of loaded quiet that comes when someone is holding their breath, waiting. I tried again, louder this time. I have food and water if you need assistance. Again, nothing but silence. I waited, listening, but heard only the normal sounds of night in the mountains. Wind through the pines, the distant splash of a fish jumping, the echo of my own voice fading across the water. But I knew someone was out there. Years of wilderness experience had taught me to distinguish between natural sounds and human presence, and every instinct I developed was screaming that I was being watched from the darkness beyond my fire. When I finally retreated to my tent, I found myself doing things I'd never done in 18 years of solo camping. I zipped the rainfly completely closed, eliminating the ventilation that would normally keep condensation from building up inside. I kept my flashlight within easy reach and made sure my hiking boots were positioned for quick access. Most telling of all, I found myself lying awake, listening to every sound outside the thin nylon walls that separated me from whatever was lurking in the forest. Several times during the night, I heard footsteps circling my tent. They were careful, deliberate, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to move quietly through the forest. The steps would approach to within feet of my tent, pause as if the person was listening or observing, then move away to a different position. It felt like being stalked by a predator that was intelligent enough to maintain distance while studying its prey. Morning brought no relief from the psychological pressure. When I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, the first thing I noticed were the footprints. They were everywhere around my campsite, in the soft earth near the fire ring, along the path to the lake, circling my tent at various distances. The prints were clearly human, made by boots with a distinctive tread pattern, and they were fresh. I followed the trail, trying to understand the pattern of movement they revealed. Whoever had made them had spent considerable time walking around my camp during the night, approaching from different angles, stopping at what appeared to be optimal observation points. Some of the prints came within 3 feet of my tent, close enough that the person could have heard me breathing inside. While I was examining the evidence of my nighttime visitor, movement across the lake caught my attention. The man was back, walking along the far shore with the same slow, purposeful gait I'd observed the previous day. As I watched, he returned to the same boulder where he'd spent yesterday and settled into his watching position. This time, I was determined to get some kind of response. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted across the water with all the volume I could muster. "Hey, what do you want? Why are you watching me?" The sound echoed off the surrounding peaks and faded into silence. The man showed no reaction whatsoever. No acknowledgement that he'd heard me, no change in posture, no indication that my words had registered at all. He simply continued his motionless observation as if I hadn't spoken. I tried a different approach, shouting, "Are you hurt? Do you need help getting back to the trailhead?" Again, nothing. The man sat like a statue, focused entirely on my camp, with an intensity that made my skin crawl. That's when I realized I had to leave. The decision went against everything I'd planned for this trip. I'd hiked 6 brutal miles to reach one of the most beautiful and remote fishing spots in the region. I'd been looking forward to this adventure for months, planning it as a perfect combination of challenging hiking and pristine angling. Under normal circumstances, nothing short of a medical emergency would have driven me away from such an ideal location. But the sustained observation, the nighttime prowling, the complete lack of response to friendly communication, it all added up to something that felt dangerous in ways I couldn't define. My 18 years of wilderness experience had taught me to trust my instincts above all else, and every instinct I possessed was telling me this situation was wrong. I began breaking camp with the efficiency of long practice, but I found myself constantly glancing across the lake to monitor the man's position. He watched my every move as I packed my tent, stuffed my sleeping bag, and organized my gear for the hike out. When I shouldered my backpack and started walking toward the trail, he stood up and began moving parallel to my route along the opposite shore. The sight of him pacing my departure was perhaps the most disturbing moment of the entire encounter. It suggested a level of interest in my activities that went far beyond casual curiosity. It felt calculating, predatory, like he was filing away information about my patterns and behaviors for future reference. The hike back to the trailhead took 4 hours, and I pushed the pace harder than was probably wise for the steep descent. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following me down the trail, but the path behind me remained empty. Only when I reached my caravan in the parking area did I finally feel safe enough to stop constantly checking my back trail. I never reported the incident to park rangers or law enforcement. What crime had been committed? What law had been broken? A man had watched me from across a lake and walked around my campsite at night. Technically, none of that was illegal, and I had no evidence of any actual threat or aggressive behavior. But the encounter haunted me. I found myself thinking about it during other camping trips, wondering who the man was and what he'd been doing at Emerald Lake. Was he mentally ill, perhaps suffering from some condition that explained his strange fixation? Was he living rough in the mountains, surviving by methods I couldn't identify? Had he been planning something more sinister that my early departure had prevented? The questions bothered me enough that I avoided that area for 2 full years. When I finally decided to return to Emerald Lake, I brought along a camping buddy, an experienced hiker who laughed when I told him about my mysterious watcher, but agreed that the story was unsettling enough to warrant company. We spent 3 days at the lake, fishing and hiking, and enjoying the spectacular alpine scenery. The man never appeared. There were no strange footprints around our camp, no sense of being observed, no nighttime visits from uninvited guests. It was exactly the kind of peaceful wilderness experience I'd originally sought. My friend joked that I'd probably encountered some harmless mountain hermit who'd been as curious about me as I'd been disturbed by him. Maybe he was right. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for what I'd experienced during that first solo trip. But I don't think so. There was something fundamentally wrong about that encounter, something that 18 years of wilderness experience couldn't explain or rationalize. The man's behavior, his apparent lack of gear or supplies, his complete indifference to communication, none of it fit any normal pattern of human behavior in the backcountry. I still camp solo regularly, still seek out remote locations where I can experience true solitude. But I'm more aware now of the fact that not every human presence in the wilderness will be benign or explicable. Most people who venture into remote places are like me, seeking peace, adventure, connection with nature. But some people go to the wilderness for darker reasons, drawn by the isolation and the vulnerability of those who travel alone into places where help is days away and witnesses are non-existent. The man at Emerald Lake is still out there somewhere. I'm sure of it. And I'm equally sure that I wasn't the first solo camper he'd observed with that same unsettling intensity, nor will I be the last.